And as folks continue to come in, I just want to say thank you for coming to today's webinar. My name is Tyler DeVillius. I'm the Director of External Affairs for the Conservative Energy Network. CEN is a national 501c3 nonprofit with state and local teams in 25 states across the country. From local government to state capitals to the halls of Congress, CEN is a leader in advancing American-made clean energy solutions. Today's webinar kicks off our new Empowering Tomorrow webinar series, which will be a monthly series. We recognize that energy demand is surging across the country as America brings manufacturing back to the United States, builds data centers necessary to sustain a 21st century economy, and leads technological advances made possible by artificial intelligence. This increased demand makes transmission reform and grid modernization crucial to American ingenuity, economic development, and national security. Building transmission lines is a lengthy and complex process. Like other major infrastructure projects, transmission lines can face delays that aren't measured in weeks or months or years. They can be measured in decades. Last year, the US added only 251 miles of high voltage transmission lines, a number that has been declining for over a decade. Unfortunately, this pales in comparison to our economic rival China, who completed nearly 80 times more high voltage transmission than the United States. Historically, transmission policy has always been bipartisan, with conservatives even leading reforms in the early 2000s and shaping many provisions found in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. It will require all of us to overcome today's hyper-partisan dynamics if we are to build the transmission capacity that our nation desperately needs. Without a focus on permitting reform and transmission modernization, it will be impossible to get electrons from energy projects to consumers and grow our economy. The increasing demand for energy will cause a stress on our grid and further exacerbate blackouts. America cannot afford to be held hostage by an aging electric infrastructure system. As we'll discuss on the call today, improved planning can alleviate grid congestion and lower electricity bills for consumers. Longer-term planning also improves reliability, which leads to fewer days with higher energy demand. This means fewer blackouts and fewer price spikes that strain consumers' pocketbooks. Today's conversation is particularly timely because FERC announced just last week that they will be issuing a ruling on May 13th that will fill some gaps in the Commission's existing regional transmission planning and cost allocation requirements. Our panelists today will dive further into what that rule might do and what effect it will have on our nation's economy. I know that you didn't log on today to hear me drone on, so without further ado, I do want to briefly introduce our panelists and then dive into the conversation. Bryn Baker is Senior Director for Market and Policy Innovation at the Clean Energy Buyers Association, more commonly known as CEBA. Bryn leads CEBA's work to influence policies that expand opportunities and accelerate approaches that allow all energy buyers to access cost-competitive clean energy. Bryn holds a master's degree in environmental policy from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's of arts degree in biology from the University of Colorado Boulder. Michelle Query is the Southeast Regional Director for Chambers for Innovation and Clean Energy. She works with chamber and economic development professionals across the Southeast on how to best navigate renewable energy development to help their communities prosper. She previously served as Director of Economic Development for Carteret County in North Carolina. And Michelle is a graduate of Texas A&M University and has earned a Master's of Arts in Public Administration from Webster University. And last but not least, Ted Thomas is the former chairman of the Arkansas Public Services Commission, and he is currently the founding partner of Energize Strategies, a very aptly named firm. Prior to his 2015 appointment by Governor Asa Hutchinson, Ted worked as a chief deputy prosecuting attorney for Arkansas's 20th Judicial District. He also served as a budget director to former Governor Mike Huckabee. Ted received both his bachelor's degree and his JD from the University of Arkansas and has a wide breadth of experience navigating transmission issues in the MISO and SPP regions. Before we turn it over to Ted to kick off our conversation, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be taking audience questions at the end of the panel conversation. You can submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and also want to flag for folks that a recording of this webinar will be made available to all attendees. So with that in mind, Ted, FERC has recently issued a sunshine notice for an upcoming meeting on May 13th, where they plan to finalize a NOPR on long-term planning and cost allocation. Would love if you could start our conversation today with a brief, 5 or so minute overview of what that rule might entail, and then we'll open it up here to a broader conversation. So Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tyler. Of course, a NOPR stands for Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. This notice has been out there for a while. There's thousands and thousands of pages of comments, and what FERC will do a couple of weeks from now is take all of those comments and decide how to modify or not modify what they had proposed and put out what we call a final rule. The first thing that the rule does is it supplements existing planning processes for existing planning regions that are shorter term and also requires them, in addition to what they're already doing, to do longer term planning. Long-term planning is important. There's a risk with long-term planning, and that's the further out you get, the more unknowns you're dealing with. But there's also a risk of not doing long-term planning, and that you get behind the eight ball on load growth, and then we don't have transmission that's needed to serve load to build businesses, create jobs, and to grow the economy. So in this time of transition, it's important that we take a little bit longer, even though there's some modeling risks that we take, because the pace of change is threatening to swamp our existing planning systems. One thing about planning from a conservative perspective, of course, state planning of the economy is anathema to conservatives, but it's important to remember that this is a different kind of planning. This is planning for a network, that in the normal economy, you want the market, supply and demand to decide these things, but the market doesn't produce networks. When you think about network economics, like a water network, a sewer network, the highway network, or the transmission grid, these things don't emerge from markets typically because you need standardization. We don't care what side of the road you drive on, just as long as everybody knows what side of the road they're supposed to drive on. You need interoperability, and then you need access. If you have a network like this that's owned in private, it's tempting for them to use that market power of the network to push into other areas. So even as a conservative, it's important that a network be well planned and rational. Well, the first thing it does is require longer planning horizon. The second thing it does is require standardization of benefits to consider and scenarios to consider when doing this planning. That way, when everybody's speaking the same language across all of these various planning entities that exist that cover the entire country, over time you can develop best practices in terms of how to measure these benefits, what the benefits should be, and also what scenarios. There are different scenarios that you project out in terms of what is the pace of technological change, what is the pace of economic growth, what is the pace of load growth. And what we do is we try to have a variety of scenarios. You don't pick one point on the horizon and say, well, that's what we think the future is going to be, because you're probably going to be wrong. What you need is a broad range of scenarios, and that's what the rule requires. It also seeks to incentivize upsizing small local reliability projects into larger projects that, even though by itself it would cost more, the cost of a larger project is less than the variety of small projects that we're trying to get basically consolidated into. It basically increases the size of your planning area, and so that there's money that can be saved by upsizing. You get both a more robust grid and you save some money on the same time. It also addresses questions related to cost allocation. It doesn't impose a methodology of cost allocation, but what it tries to do is create side rails so that the inevitable negotiation between basically the states, the state utility commissions, the state utility service territories, the folks who pay the bills, to make sure that the benefits are roughly commensurate with the costs that those folks are being charged. It also provides ways for states outside of the normal planning process to initiate themselves long-term transmission planning. They want to do it through the existing planning entities, that's fine. If they want to do it on their own outside of those entities, that's fine as well. There's a few other consumer protection type things. One thing requires dynamic line ratings be considered when planning transmission. Different outside air temperatures change the capacity of lines in ways that used to be able to not measure. Now we can measure those things. So we want to include those in our planning criteria, and then some other consumer protections, including something called construction work in progress, which is a hole that we really don't want to fall into in this. It's utility regulation on Canada, but there's some other stuff in there, consumer protections as well. And finally, I'll conclude by saying there's a couple of things that it does not do. It does not mandate the construction of any lines. It does not diminish the state role over being the entity that decides which costs the ratepayers have to pay and which they do not. It does not require those kinds of things. It basically standardizes and creates a permissible way for states to agree to do these things if they choose to do so. That's a broad, quick summary of what's in the rule. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ted. We're going to put a pin in the pain part of this, right? We have the permitting, planning, and pain, and any transmission project. We're going to put a pin in that and come back to that a little bit later. But first of all, thank you for that overview. I think it was a great job of outlining what's in a pretty meaty document. And for Michelle and Bryn, would love to hear from both of you on how you assess the current state of transmission in our country, and anything you might like to see FERC address in its final ruling, and how this really affects your constituencies that you're representing. Whether, Michelle, it's you on the economic development side of things and companies bringing private investment into communities, or Bryn on the buyer side of things. Would love to open up to any thoughts you all might have.
Well, sure, I'll jump in. Thank you for that. Ted, you did an excellent job sort of prognosticating what we might see out of a final rule. And maybe just by way of introduction, SEBA is it's a community of large commercial, industrial, institutional energy buyers, all trying to buy clean energy. These are buyers like Cargill, Lockheed Martin, Chevron, Northrop Grumman, Dow, the Defense Logistics Agency, which coordinates energy buying for the largest energy buyer in the country, the Department of Defense. These energy buyers have collectively contracted now for around 77 gigawatts of new build, mostly wind, solar, and battery storage. And that's equivalent to about half of all of the pollution-free energy capacity that the U.S. has installed in that period. And the reasons they're doing this are actually pretty simple. It's because wind and solar are usually now the cheapest forms of energy, and they reduce price volatility. And for businesses that are looking to address long-term risks, clean energy is really critical to reducing a whole host of risks. That's why DoD is scaling up their energy procurement. And one of the chief bottlenecks to scaling that up is transmission, but it's actually a much broader set of challenges, as you sort of laid out. I'd say one, energy consumers everywhere are literally paying the price for congested transmission lines. I think a study came out that said that it's about $20 billion in 2022 that across the country consumers are paying. And that in particularly on certain grids, transmission congestion means you have to curtail or shut off certain generators, which means not only are we wasting that energy, but it's affecting offtake agreements, which ultimately costs consumers money. Secondly, I'd say generally speaking, we're not building the right transmission. Right now, we're building transmission in the most expensive way possible. And Ted, you sort of touched on this because transmission and distribution costs are the biggest slice of increasing power bills across the country. And 90% of the transmission we're building are local lines. That means mostly within the utility service territory. And there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with that. But they don't always have to go through a certificate of public necessity process that comes with prudence testing and regulatory oversight. And you could also, look at this as you could build 2 or 3 local lines in this utility or 2 to 3 lines in the neighboring utility. If you're only looking at within that service territory, but what if you built one larger line between the two, or you trade lower cost power across a region from one to another. Those are the larger, more cost efficient lines that bring consumers benefits, and why we study after study saying you get sort of a 2 to 3-fold ratio of benefit to the cost for most of these lines. That goes to consumers. But you have to have a position of elevation and move beyond parochial planning processes to see those opportunities. And granted, some regions are doing that, but not every region is. And so I think really what this rule is about, it's leveling the planning approaches across the whole country. And then maybe third, I've just touched on, Ted, you sort of also raised this. We're staring down 90 gigawatts of new energy demand by 2033. If you look at Texas, they've got a peak load of 85 gigawatts. So it's kind of like adding another Texas worth of capacity. We've got to build that. Michelle, I think as you're about to say, that's a huge economic opportunity. Capturing billions of dollars of investment in maturing industries and modernizing infrastructure, the semiconductor chip manufacturing and data centers that really underpin a modern digital economy. We're going to want those industries here and not somewhere else, which means we need a lot more energy, but that means a lot more transmission. And if it takes 12 years to build a new long distance transmission line, and we've got 2.6 terawatts of generation stuck in interconnection queues across the country, that's actually more than twice the total capacity of the entire US grid. It's a huge opportunity. We've got generation assets that want to build, but we can't clear the queues fast enough. And so all that really just takes back to, we've got to modernize and expand our grid to accommodate these industries that are really scouting everywhere for where can they find reliable, affordable, and clean energy. That's fundamental to capturing all of this economic and job creation opportunities. But we've got to turn this rule into an opportunity to see that it's really the long-term planning that enables that. I think we've touched on that the draft rule required long-term planning. We expect that to change. I think the big thing, if I'm really getting to your question, Tyler, is we're looking for the final rule to standardize a set of reliability and economic benefits, which would be used to evaluate these proposed lines. Because without that, we're going to continue to use apples, oranges, and pears to assess the economic and reliability benefits, which will just continue to make it harder for states to work with each other and speak the same language, and approving these bigger, more cost-efficient lines that we need to look after benefits for consumers.
And I love your point, Brent, about standardization, because we know that these projects are highly coveted and states are competing, for these projects. So I love the comment about standardization. Also, your point about the local transmission lines. I asked the question, can investment in energy infrastructure lead directly to growth, or does it simply follow growth? And I think in the way we've done our economic incentives in the past is where, states have created a package and they've looked at needs and they've kind of figured out how to recruit this specific project. And so it's kind of followed the growth. And I think now, our economic development organizations, our communities are looking at what they want to be, what they want to attract, what works for them. And so they're actually doing longer term economic development planning. It's, economic development's changed a little bit in the fact that we just, put the information out there. This is what our area is capable of doing, and then hope a project is attracted to that. And now we're actively planning for what these communities, want to be and what projects they want to attract. And so with that, I love the idea of, like you're talking about, of standardizing, these processes so that there can be some long-term planning and some certainty in what to expect.
And I think what I heard from both Brent and Michelle, and thank you for that, is standardization and certainty, which are very popular with the business community. One of the lesser, criteria that businesses like to consider, it's always a sticky wicket, is the cost side of things, right? And how much is this going to cost, and who's going to be paying for this? Ted, I know that in your laydown of everything that's in the rule, you touched a little bit on the cost allocation side, but I was wondering if you could dive a little bit deeper into that and go into a little bit more detail of, who will pay for this and what the commission is considering in terms of the cost allocation side of things.
If there was a MISO board member that would always say the thorny issue of
I
cost
like that.
allocation, which is a very good description because it's always difficult. It's always a negotiation. A couple of basics first. Cost allocation is done on projections. We project what we think the benefits will be. And of course, the building is going to happen later. And the reason the certainty is important is because that's how you finance these things. So we project what the benefits we think will be, and those are fixed, even if things develop differently. But you need that for certainty to build it. And I want to add a little bit of emphasis to a point that Bryn made in terms of the benefits. How do you benefit from transmission? Well, you benefit transmission by saving on generation. Transmission enables a broader list of generation sources to choose from. And of course, the system is operated in a way where the cheapest is dispatched. So where you save on transmission is on your generation costs. And these $2 to $3 to 1 is $1 of transmission investment typically leads to $2 to $3 of cheaper generation that you're able to access because of the transition. Now, there are two principles in cost allocation that are kind of in conflict that are both deeply established in FERC precedent. One is the cost causer pays. Whoever causes the cost pays. The other is that benefits should be commensurate, or the cost should be commensurate with the benefits. Now, how this might work is if you think of a group dinner, everybody's having dinner, they're having a great time. They're done with dinner, the person you want to see the dessert menu, and one person pipes up and says, yeah, why don't you bring us X and we'll share it. Now, who is the cost causer? Well, the cost causer is the one that said, why don't you bring us the dessert and we'll share it. But if you want benefits to be commensurate, the cost to be commensurate to the benefits, you'll try to measure how much each person eats. You'll divide the cost of the dessert and you'll add it to these bills. These two principles are in conflict because it's really hard to get everybody on board in the same way on the front end so that they're all the cost causers. But with 2020 hindsight, when you can see that somebody benefits, well, under this other principle, they're supposed to pay. But at the end of the day, cost allocation is always about negotiation. It's about negotiation over the projections. It's about negotiation over how much the line will cost. It's about negotiation over everything. And each transmission line is a one-off. You can't prescribe by rule how to do it because at the end of the day, the people who represent the retail ratepayers that have to pay for these lines are going to negotiate with each other in a complex, thorny negotiation to try to agree. That's the way it is before the rule. That's the way it will be after the rule. Now, the rule will standardize and make it easier and put some bumper rails on the edges of it to make it easier. But at the end of the day, it's a difficult and complex negotiation that has to be completed in order to build stuff that spans multiple states.
Thanks for that, Ted. The dessert analogy really drove it home, and I don't believe in sharing dessert. But one of the things that we know comes alongside this bill is if you don't benefit, you don't pay. As the rule is currently written, and so that's fine because then I can order all the desserts and I will benefit and I will pay accordingly. But Brennan and Michelle, FERC actually lists some of the potential beneficiaries in NOPR, and those considerations include economic benefits alongside the reliability and affordability that we've talked about here. Would love if you could shed some light on how private companies and local economic development organizations might be viewing those considerations as they're out either competing for companies to come to their locality or making business decisions in terms of where to make capital investment.
Bryn, I'll let you take this when you're working with more private companies and you may have more input there on the private side.
Sure. I mean, I think that you sort of articulated the beneficiary pays principle. I would articulate and underscore the opposite, which is if you don't benefit, you don't pay. So let's remember that. And Ted, it's almost like the dinner party is even more complicated because not only are we just trying to figure out how to allocate costs, but we're actually trying to invite more people to the party. And Michelle, you sort of said this. It's almost like we need to shift to the mindset of if you build it, they'll come. And that feels even a little bit more speculative. But fundamentally, it is about negotiation and states talking to each other. And I think we have to remember that the rule is not fundamentally changing that dynamic. States are in charge of negotiating this. In terms of kind of what we can posit from what we've seen so far, the draft rule of like, what do those benefits actually look like that we're now trying to talk about? The draft rule included a list of 12. They were economic and reliability benefits. And the draft rule framed those as optional for states to consider, sort of like guidance. At least what we're saying is that the status quo is what's not working here. And so to change the status quo and make sure for the benefit of consumers and states that stand to gain more from a reliable, affordable, modernized grid that can capture these economic opportunities, we all need to be using a standardized set of metrics, benefits metrics, which are themselves still really high level and actually leave a lot of room for state appropriate interpretation. These are things like, you sort of said it, but access to lower cost generation, reduced excess capacity, reduced congestion costs, benefits of mitigating extreme weather outages, increased competition. So that standardized set of metrics needs to be required because we feel like that's what it takes to meaningfully change the planning process to really capture the full set of benefits that frankly have nothing to do with clean energy requirements, but have everything to do with responsibly building a more reliable low-cost grid that is built to compete globally and withstand increasing extreme weather. And that in that frame, it's hard to argue that there aren't benefits to then talk about allocating appropriately using beneficiary pays.
Thanks for that, Bryn. Really, really appreciate that. And also, I know there's a tagline out there, build, baby, build, right? And how can we expand our nation's energy infrastructure, both from a generation side, but also from ensuring that we can get those electrons to the end use consumers. And Ted, I'm going to come to you just to put a bow on kind of this front end of the conversation, and the back end would love to dive more into the economic development benefits that come with transmission and what this rule may enable. And I do want to remind folks, if you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit it. We'll be sure to get to that here in just a few minutes. But Ted, as a former public services commissioner in a red state like Arkansas, right? It's been red for quite some time now. How do you view the implementation of this potential rule for some of your colleagues in PSCs across the country? And as a conservative, do you have any concern about where FERC is taking this rule, infringing on your state's rights to plan and permit transmission projects? And on that note, we lost Ted. So we'll see if he comes back. I definitely want to hear from him. He's the expert on these things. So we'll dive in and just to shift gears a little bit. Michelle, as somebody who's deeply involved in local economic development, how do you perceive the role of increased transmission capacity in terms of fostering that culture, that spirit of economic growth and enhancing resilience within local communities?
Oh goodness. Well, being on the coast, obviously, I'm in an environment where, whether we have extreme weather and, we have that across the country, but, so to Bryn's point about all these projects that are trying to come online, obviously we see the need to upgrade, and we're looking at multiple technologies now, so much more solar, we're looking at offshore wind. And, one of the points I wanted to make as far as just like economic benefits and opportunities, I mean, let's look at the ports up and down the East Coast who are engaging in the offshore wind sector, right? So this is an emerging industry. And whether it be trying to recruit a manufacturer, whether it be you're upgrading your port, to marshal these parts out to the sites. If you look at Port of Connecticut, they did some forward thinking, long range planning, made major investments in their port, and they attracted this economic development. As a result of that, now other economic benefits are ensuing for projects, that are closely related in proximity. Maybe it's redeveloping land that's not been used in a while. And then by upgrading that, you're now making communities more secure, more resilient, because you're upgrading all around. So it's just, there's so many tangible benefits as well. When it's not just like looking at, oh, if we do this, we can recruit this project. Now we're looking at workforce development issues, some affordable housing. So people are taking regional approaches when they're looking at where they want to locate their projects. And I think they also are looking at a mix of technologies that they can use, right? And so how do we get that mix on the grid? And we do that through upgrading and reliable transmission. I'd be interested in Bryn's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it really is fundamental that, right now we're in a frame where the race is on to find available, affordable, clean electrons. And I think these industries are projected to need so much power that, first they're looking at where can they get power. But also so many of these companies are committed to using clean energy. And of course, every customer wants reliable power. So the missing factor is really, to answer this three-part equation of reliable, affordable, clean, it is transmission. And because we're not building enough of it, we have to ask this question: why are we not building enough of it? Tyler, you said it. I mean, we're falling behind competitors. China's built 30 times more transmission than we have last decade. Even Europe's built six-fold more. So we need to position ourselves to win all of this economic development. There is more than enough generation to fulfill a lot of this coming demand. Transmission is the bottleneck. So that's really why the energy customer is getting loud about the need, and why long-term planning and standardization is what's needed to fix big chunks of what's holding things back.
Thanks, Bryn. Bryn, in your experience, just kind of looking across the board at all the different buyers and the different environments that they're in, or do you see any regions, any RTOs across the country that are getting it right in terms of planning, more so than others?
Well, I mean, I think ASAG and Grid Strategies put out a report that's basically a report card. So that's a good place to dig into the specifics. But I think you'll see MISO often gets the highest grades across a wide number of criteria. I mean, the reality is nobody's ace in this one, but we could look to the bright spot of what are planners doing that's getting lines built. And the reality is MISO is getting lines built. They're identifying things that they need. Texas 10 years ago built a bunch of lines. PJM has done some. So there's bright spots to look at. And I think the biggest sort of cross-cutting lesson from all of that is that they're rising up over just looking at parochial interest. Do I need it in this one particular location? And saying, are there broader benefits that the region can capture by looking at higher lines and spreading those benefits and costs over their area?
Thank you.
Ted, is there anything
and Michelle, does
MISO specifically?
Yes, on an overview of RTOs, these regional markets, that about 50% and about half as to geography and load are in. And this relates to the jurisdiction question. First, I apologize, my internet blinked off, so now I'm rolling with a cell phone. I'm not sure what the problem is. I haven't destroyed any property yet, but I'll get to percussive therapy after our call. The RTO markets, because transmission allows generation to have a broad reach, both in terms of capacity and energy, go farther. That means you can share, and it reduces reserve margins that are required, which saves money. And it also means that as the system is being operated, in a manner in which the cheapest stuff not running is used to meet new load, it gives you a broader pool to pull from. And I know in Arkansas, this saved in the energy system alone through MISO saved about $50 million a year. Now, so when you look at the rule, do I worry about state jurisdiction? I really don't, particularly if you're in a retail market already. There's some jurisdiction you give up to save $50 million a year because you're working, you've agreed, you've bound yourself to work with other states and share these resources. But for $50 million a year that goes straight into ratepayers' pockets, it's worth it. And I agree with the notion that MISO is probably ahead. I also agree, they're the best student in a class that the whole class could be doing better. Them and SPP both. They've done these longer term transmission planning studies already. They'll continue to do them. They've done a lot of the stuff by the rule already. They're more worried about the rule not changing their nomenclature, changing how they do things so they can continue to do things. And one point that I would add to something that Bryn said, in 2010 in MISO North, they did this MVP project. And when you look back, that you forecast all this stuff and you worry about, are your forecast right? But when you look back at those lines, they're all fully subscribed, which means somebody found value in using them. And that's the case with pretty much every transmission line. There are no bridges to nowhere in the transmission world. With load growing, we need these lines, and when they're used, because they're fixed cost, it pushes down the cost for everybody when you get full usage out of the line. I hope that was responsive to the question. Again, apologize for the interruption of my internet service.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Ted. Michelle, is that something that you're seeing as you work across the Southeast? Are, close your eyes, which for you and your background, you probably don't need to close them all that long to imagine being a project developer for a company that's looking to relocate or to expand. Where is energy falling into their considerations, alongside maybe incentives or different things that might be coming, just how much of that demand is out there? And I mean, if we keep building more and more transmission, do you think it'll ring true that there aren't those bridges to nowhere?
Oh, absolutely. And, when you look at traditional site selection, that is one of the criteria that site selectors use to determine if an area is going to be, beneficial for a project. And, in the Southeast, we're seeing unprecedented, job creation, investment. The time is now. A lot of it has to do with the IRA tax credits for these, clean energy projects. We're seeing developers, we're seeing, in Georgia, North Carolina and some South Carolina EV manufacturing. We're seeing a lot of that being located here in the Southeast. If you're working in Virginia, you'll hear the term data center alley, in Virginia. So, the demand for growth is there. The demand for, I think, multiple technologies, is there. We've talked a little bit about companies, and I know Bryn is more familiar than I, but, they have sustainability goals now. They have shareholders that they're answering to in order to implement those goals. So they're looking for, a mix of renewables. So it's not just as black and white of an issue as it used to be, as far as, can this particular area handle our needs? It's more forward thinking now. I think there's more thought into what that generation looks like. And then also, we're seeing unprecedented demands to connect to the grid. So yes, we're seeing a lot of growth in the Southeast, a lot of opportunity. And again, with the IRA tax credits in place for effectively another 8 years, since we're about 2 years into this, timing, I think, is critical in this regard to get this right.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Michelle. Go ahead, Bryn.
In the Southeast, it's tricky because when you look at like Lawrence Berkeley National Lab did a study that they continuously updated that was looking at, if you build more of this national transmission network, like what Ted's talking about, it's just a network of one. What are the benefits? And most of the benefits, half of the benefits in the hundreds of millions of dollars happen during extreme weather. That's based on locational marginal pricing. We don't actually know what the benefits of transmission are transparently because we don't have that kind of pricing structure. But you can sort of look at the broader dynamics. There's been tremendous load growth in the Southeast because there has been some excess capacity. When you do market studies, a big part of the production cost savings that show even the Southeast would benefit from that is because there was some excess capacity that consumers were paying for. The reality is that's gone. So we're now in a world where there's not enough electrons and there's not enough transmission. And so you almost can't build a bridge to nowhere at this point. And I know one commissioner at FERC in particular has said this quite a bit, is that he's worried about building bridges to nowhere. The reality is with the amount of growth that we're seeing, there is no way to meet all of that demand without significantly building transmission.
Yeah. And to add to that, when the RTOs came on, there was a whole lot. It was a reaction to the blackout that happened in 2003 that started with one line failing in Ohio, went up to Canada, and back down the Northeast. There's been billions and billions of dollars spent on transmission since then that has all been paid for by generation savings. And that's good policy. Now, it hasn't gone fast enough, which is why we're looking at what the next step is. But in all of that transmission building, there were no bridges to nowhere. The savings that were projected have actually been realized. SPP does a thing called RCAR, ARCAR, something like that. I should know the acronym, which is a looking back study. What if we take this transmission line out and redo the system? And you can really pinpoint where the savings were. But there have been no bridges to nowhere, despite the fact that there's been significant investment.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ted. One last question here to sort of wrap up our conversation before moving into Q&A. And again, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Looking into your crystal ball, and this is for all our panelists, how would better planned transmission impact the American economy 5, 10, 20 years from now? Is it us getting ahead of global competitors? Is it us attracting more investment into local communities? Would just love to hear any thoughts that might be out there.
I think it's all of the above. And I think it allows local communities, for instance, communities that have not traditionally had the resources maybe to attract new investment, because now they're, like to Bryn's point, on a more competitive playing field. And I think that that always allows the opportunities for communities to attract new investment. I think when it comes to these economic development projects, these regions are taking a regional approach to this. And so the regional planning aspect of it, I think, will be important as these regions kind of seek to define themselves and attract new investment. But absolutely, I think, it just goes to competitiveness.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. Bryn, Ted, anything to add?
What we don't want is an energy price constrained economy that chokes off investment. That's what we're trying to avoid. And transmission can help us avoid that. With also, there's going to be investment in generation, but by optimizing where the cheapest generation is serving the load from the broadest area possible, you can avoid the situation. The other thing that's really important, when you increase this network, you don't know who's going to get hit, but somebody is. There were massive amounts of power transferred from the east to the west when Winter Storm Uri hit. Now, they still hit the wall in Texas. We also had brief outages in MISO South and in SPP. But it would have been a lot worse had there not been the existing interregional transfer capability. And when you build these stuff like this, you don't know who's going to get hit. You don't know who's going to be needing help or providing help. But the capacity for one region to help the other when you have these severe weather events, literally in which people's lives are on the line, is enhanced when you build out a national transmission grid.
mean, that's it. And so I guess, if it's a crystal ball question, I would just sort of round out with what we hope to be really a nonpartisan vision, that we've built a transmission network that keeps prices steady, is built to withstand extreme weather, which allows us to minimize loss and damage, certainly not just to businesses, but all of us. We all rely on the transmission system to keep the lights on and keep us safe. And that while we do that, we haven't sacrificed, in the march to dramatically expand our grid to meet this growing economic opportunity, that we also need to dramatically expand generation that produces transmission. Those things don't have to be in conflict. We can do all of these things if we plan for it. And if you plan for it, then you need to have a common framework. And that's really fundamentally what this rule can give us.
Wonderful. Thanks, Brent. I'm going to go ahead and take a moderator's personal privilege to kick off Q&A here. And Ted, I'm going to come back to the question where we lost you on, because I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. Going back to the potential FERC ruling, in your role as a former PSC commissioner and chair of a PSC, how do you view the implementation of that rule once it's passed? And as a conservative, are you concerned about it infringing on a state's rights to plan and permit transmission process or projects?
I'm not concerned about that. And in our case, and I probably was insufficiently clear, whatever jurisdiction we gave up to join MISO was a good deal. And I don't think we gave up very much. We basically agreed to share resources. And when you share resources, then you're selling your surplus. And then when you need a little bit more, you have an opportunity to buy, and then you net those out. And that's where that $50 million comes from. So yeah, you give up a little bit because you're sharing, but you're saving $50 million a year when folks are struggling to pay their electric bill. It's a good deal. The cooperation between states is voluntary. Now, you do have the potential for a free ridership problem that needs to be avoided, that if you're building a line and you have 1,000 people that voluntarily signed up for easement and you have one that knows they're the last one, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to jack up the price. It's human nature to do that. You need some safeguards to keep that from happening. And otherwise, it's agreement. You voluntarily share, and you voluntarily joint plan, and you voluntarily depend on each other, because by yourself, you have to have more capacity for reserves. As soon as you agree to share, you save a lot of money with a lower reserve margin, but then you're somewhat interdependent on your neighbor. But when you're saving $50 million a year, it's a good deal that we voluntarily entered into that. Nobody told us we had to do that. We did that voluntarily. I don't think it threatens state jurisdiction. It's a little bit different mix for the non-RTO people, but they're already under Order 1000, which requires both RTO areas and non-RTO areas to do regional planning. They could do a better job of that regional planning, and I hope the rule addresses that.
Great. Thanks.
If I could just tack on a little bit, because I think around this question of how does it change the dynamic for states? I mean, I think fundamentally what I hear Ted saying is it doesn't fundamentally change that. But there's been a lot of discussion around whether the rule and how it addresses public policy as one of those drivers for transmission, and whether that's ultimately going to force states to pay for things that they didn't want. Now, we've already talked about the beneficiary areas and how if you don't benefit, you don't pay. But I think there's sort of at least two other things to say about that. One, public policy, I think we need to be clear that unless there's a dramatic reversal, is not in the list of things to evaluate the need for these lines under. It's not in the rule as one of those metrics. I think that was a smart decision. They could have included public policy drivers, but they didn't. And so the benefits metrics are fundamentally about economic and reliability, period. I think secondly, for context, it's also important that sort of in the broader scheme of what's driving the transmission need, we've talked about so much of it, but that corporate demand for clean energy is actually a bigger driver for transmission need than state RPS and CES right now. So you've got sort of both corporate demand and then economic growth are the biggest drivers for the need here. And so, I'd posit that given how much transmission infrastructure is decades old, and that, Michelle, as you said, we're competing with other countries for these new industries that need a lot of power. We are going to build a lot of transmission based purely on reliability and economic grounds alone. And that's fundamentally why we need this rule. And I think
Really well.
also sort of follows that if a state does need a transmission line to meet their goal, then what you would infer from a beneficiary pays is that that state should pay. But fundamentally, I think what we're spending most of our time talking about here is beneficiary pays applies to meeting the economic and reliability benefits, of which there are many, and it's a broader list than what many regions consider.
Really well said, Bryn. Thanks for teeing that up. Actually, you teed up our first Q&A here. In terms of money available from reasonably charging ratepayers to invest in transmission, is the amount being spent on transmission line maintenance versus the amount left over for new transmission line development potentially insufficient for the load growth we're seeing? And if so, what kind of remedies are available that won't dramatically increase costs for ratepayers? Not sure if someone wants to take a stab at that.
Well, we don't really budget it like that. We don't really say this is what there is. We basically build to need. But as long as your cost benefit metrics are rigorous and solid, you're saving money on generation when you build transmission, which protects ratepayers. And then the factor isn't, you don't really budget, you do a load forecast and then you try to meet that load with generation plus transmission, because without transmission you can't deliver it. And that's how you try to stay ahead of the game. And of course, that's why the longer term is needed. When you're only looking at 18 months, you can get behind the 8 ball on a trend and get ran over. And in this instance, when you get ran over, there are businesses that don't get created, there are people that don't get hired, and there are investments that don't get made. So you want a longer term horizon so that that number that you're trying to meet, you have enough time to meet it.
Sure.
I hope that was responsive to the question.
The other thing I would just add is it's sort of like efficiency is always the first thing you should do. That's true for transmission as well. The first thing that we should be doing here is maximizing opportunities to reconduct your lines. You can get 40 to 50% more out of a line if you do that. There's a whole basket of grid enhancing technologies that ultimately save consumers a whole lot more than they cost to install. Those things in the consumer world are just no-brainers. Now, the reason that we're not doing all of them is because they're not necessarily the most advantageous for all utilities to pursue. So why and how do we build more GETs and do more reconductoring is probably not the subject of this webinar, but I think that's a key part of the answer here. The first principle here has to be we've got to squeeze everything out of our existing system before you talk about investing more in brand new transmission. And even, by the way, there's a lot more you can do with existing rights of way before you even talk about greenfield projects. So there's sort of an order of operations here to how do we build up the transmission system. I don't know exactly what the balance is between upgrading existing lines and new investment is to the original question, but I would sort of follow that order of operations, which is let's pursue the expanding existing transmission capacity first and solve that problem.
Thanks, Bryn. And Bryn, you actually did a great job. That's part of the reason why we want to have a series on transmission, right? There's so much ground to cover here. We will have one focused on innovation where we can talk about GETs and national security. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to transmission. One of the questions here, are there items that policymakers can do to help aid in transmission in their individual states, or is most of that work done at the PUC or RTO level? So it sounds like they're asking are there legislative things that state policymakers should be looking at, or is most of the meaningful reform needed at the regulatory level?
Well, we actually just left off on advancing, squeezing more out of the existing system. I think there are some state proposals out there that we're taking a look at of states creating either the right incentives or cost sharing or a variety of ways to try to make it easier to do things like gas and reconductoring. So there's certainly a legislative role to take a look at there. There's
and
also
Brent,
I would add,
sorry.
I would add siting reform to that list. Now, siting reform is really, really hard. Well, the siting reform isn't really, the siting is, there's some degree of infrastructure fatigue because so much stuff is being built and proposed that there are always challenges. There are so many different ways to stop a project, and we need to make sure that we're balancing that with the fact that if we stop too many projects, what we're going to do is we're going to stop our economy. And so siting reform, I know Congress has looked at that. There's stuff at the state level that can probably be done, but it's a difficult balance. You want people to have input. We live in a democracy after all, but at the same time, there are things you have to build, like roads and sewers and an electric grid, that you have to be able to build. And that tinkering with that balance to make sure we can build all that we need is something we might have to do.
And I would add it. Oh, sorry, Michelle, go ahead.
I said, Tyler, I'm sure siting and permitting will be the subject of another webinar, but we do talk a lot about the fact that these developers invest sometimes millions of dollars on the hope that they're able to get these projects developed, and a lot of that conversation takes place at a local elected level or a state, elected level as well.
Sure. No, I appreciate it. And I will just add in, I know there's several states, Colorado and New Mexico sort of being the first two that are looking at transmission authorities, right? Where can they streamline some of that bureaucracy to help get new transmission into the ground? I think that's an idea worth studying, as well as just general, where can we, Michelle, as you were saying, where can we streamline some of those regulations? Where can we streamline some of those permitting processes? So that we're moving at the speed of business, and that we're no longer measuring delays in decades when it comes to transmission development. I know we're pressing. I know we're pressing right up on time here, so I do want to try to sneak in one more quick question, because I think that this is interesting. How much federal money is out there to develop and upgrade transmission infrastructure in states? Are there matching funds, a formula, or other mechanisms to get this in the ground, or is it truly public-private partnerships that we need to be looking at when it comes to this level of development?
I think the short answer is not much. So there's the transmission facilitation program out of DOE. That's a total amount, 2.5 billion, which is in relative terms not much. And they're tranching that, and some projects have gotten an initial set of awards and go. I think some folks would like to see that program expand. There's still a conversation about an ITC for transmission. That's a conversation. That's not available. There's a few small pockets here and there, but fundamentally, there's not significant federal dollars to solve this. And, we sort of live by this planning, permitting, paying as the set of barriers. A lot of those conversations are on planning, which sort of necessarily kind of rests with how do you start at the federal level and push down. Permitting is state all the way up to federal, but really a state conversation. Paying is a little bit everywhere, but fundamentally, if we're going to create federal incentives, we largely haven't done that yet.
Yeah, and I agree in terms of the federal funding for the construction. There's other money that is a smaller pile of money, but it's for study. That there's quite a bit of money for study where we ought to be able to take the smartest folks there are and put them on the hardest problems with that funding. I think there's quite a bit of study money, although when the construction, Brent is correct, there's some money, there's not a lot.
And Tyler, I can quickly answer the microgrid question, which is, it's obviously something in the mix. There's a lot of energy customers that are looking seriously at that. For a lot of these folks, though, the scale just doesn't work. I mean, there are data centers that are at the gigawatt scale now. DoD, they're looking heavily and doing microgrids. At the end of the day, that's not big enough for a lot of installations. So it's a part of the solution set, but it's not the answer.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks, Brent. Well, we will leave it there. Again, more to come. We're looking forward to making this a monthly series because there's so much to talk about. when it comes to this. Thank you again to coming to today's webinar, and thank you to all of our panelists for this really great discussion and your participation this afternoon. I hope all of our attendees found the discussion as interesting and as informative as I did. I know this is certainly a very timely conversation, and more to come, not just from CEM, but I know from CICE and CEBA and all of our organizations. We will be talking a lot about this. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar will be made available to all attendees, and you can learn more about CEN by visiting www.conservativeenergynetwork.org. Thanks again for your time afternoon. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.